Welcome back. This is Brighter Morning with Bo, and we're glad to have you back. And we have Professor Patrick Watson on the line, and we're going to talk with him a little bit about the situation in Trinidad and Tobago, perhaps a little bit about the region, and we may talk a little bit, depending on how that conversation goes, we may talk about other things. Morning, Professor Watson. How are you?
Good morning, Bo. How are you? I am fine, and thanks for having me back on your program. And good morning to your viewers and your listeners everywhere.
Well, the reason I had you back so quickly, Professor Watson, is because the last time we were here, you were raising this issue of foreign exchange.
Yes.
And you were saying that whatever economic considerations we have, we could not ignore that issue of foreign exchange as the single most significant challenge that we had that we must address.
Yes.
Because you were making the point that countries like ours that are so import dependent need foreign exchange simply to survive.
That is correct.
If you had a high import bill and your way of earning foreign exchange from energy was depleting and becoming very difficult, then you had to find a way of finding that foreign exchange to be able to maintain your standard of living or your style of life. So that was the first issue. And what happened since then was that the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, we had an interview here a few days ago, and he indicated that the cabinet was going into retreat. Now, budget is usually in October, and we are at the beginning of September. In fact, we are the first day in September. So I suspect that part of that retreat was to discuss what they might do in budgetary terms in the year 2021 for the budget of 2022 that could make a difference. And the third very important issue was the IMF basically gave to Trinidad and Tobago 644 million US, which has made a big difference to the reserve position, foreign reserves position in the central bank. And I had asked the Prime Minister during my interview with him what they would be using that for. And what he said was that they would be using it to support exporting companies so that they can earn more foreign exchange, so they would help exports. And in addition to in response to a follow-up question, he said that they will also help businesses who had found themselves in difficulty, but they would be focusing on the issue of export-oriented businesses. Now, those things you and I had discussed when we met. On the last occasion that we talked. And I felt that all of these things were coming together now, and it was important to have a discussion with you. Because I think when we had the discussion, you really gave a big picture view of the challenges, and you sharply focused on the issue of foreign exchange. So, first of all, I'll ask you, I've said a mouthful there, and I'm going to ask you if you want to comment on anything. And then I'm going to go on to the follow-up question, which is, what do you think the cabinet should be discussing in Tobago?
Okay, let me start by the foreign exchange gift
Could we lift his volume, please? Yeah.
Yes, I could speak louder. I mean, are you hearing me?
We have you now. Good.
Yes, let me speak first to the foreign exchange gift that you mentioned. It's a nice amount, but it's not an elaborately big amount. Remember, we started off when the PNM came into office. There was I think there was about 11 billion.
5, yeah.
and that has since declined to about 6. So when they put that, let's say it's half a billion, a little bit more, they have gone back up to a reasonable amount. I mean, we still have a reasonable amount. I think I mentioned that the last time when we add to
Yes.
that the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. There's a good buffer that will take us through before we start to really get into serious difficulty. But the signs of us heading to serious difficulty have not changed. That gift, which is a one-off gift, is not likely to be repeated in the coming months. And the fact is, the next time we speak to the IMF, it could very well be because we want to go into an arrangement which will still involve the special drawing rights, but at this point in time, this will have to be repaid at a very, very modest rate of interest. That is true. But the fact is, it will no longer be like this, and it may be a considerably larger number. And it is likely, not likely, it will be associated with what we famously know as IMF conditionalities. This one, there's no such thing. We are more or less free to do with it as we like. It is a correct thing to use it to finance export orientation. My problem is to what extent this will be properly realized in practice. Because our manufacturing sector, as it is currently structured, and I mentioned this the last time, they do export, and they are worthy of, they are probably capable of exporting much more. But they still require a lot of foreign exchange, and they continue to be net users of foreign exchange. And I cannot see how this will help them in this short period become clearly net earners of foreign exchange. Maybe they may break even on the score, and that is better than nothing, and much better than nothing. Because we have our concerns about unemployment in the country. We have all kinds of other considerations that we're going to have to be very careful about as we go ahead. So we did get a reprieve, let me put it that way, but it's not something that we can relax on. And yes, I do believe that this should be dedicated uniquely to financing operations that will give you greater foreign exchange. Anytime you use this money to just finance local consumption, let me put it that way, whether it is to pay debts, whether it is to meet obligations to pay the public servants and so on, that is putting foreign exchange into the hands of consumers who have a large propensity to import. And that's the problem that we face in this country. And that will simply result in a depletion without something necessarily coming back to you. So if there is a commitment, and I'm not sure how it's going to be worked out, if it's going to be, you're going to be telling a company, well, look, I'm going to make this foreign exchange available to you, but you must show me plans of you marketing, penetrating the markets so that foreign exchange can come in. That is a splendid idea. That's what it should be used for. Because if we use it for just consumer activity, what we are going to do with it is take the money, go on holidays, buy apples and grapes. That's a bad example, but that gives you the idea of what it is about. And we will then have the reprieve that we got is going to dry up. Let me say something too about the pandemic has probably, in fact, I looked at the figures, it probably caused a serious slowdown in the depletion of foreign exchange. So there's one good thing about the pandemic. But as we come to an end and we are not necessarily at the end or even nearing the end, but the country is easing up. It's easing up on travel. It's easing up on activities generally. All of these things are going to result in a burst, as is happening in other countries, which is in addition to being inflationary in the other countries. In our case, it's going to result in a greater use of foreign exchange. So that is it is a concern that we are not out of the woods, not by any means. and it is useful. It's a boon that nobody in this country could earn that kind of money besides the oil sector, the petroleum sector, of course. And even they are going to have great difficulty doing it at this point in time. So it was a boon, and it has to be carefully used. And the spirit of what I heard the Prime Minister tell you, and I endorse fully, is that this should be used to encourage the non-petroleum sector. I think it can also be used. I mentioned the last time about financing innovation. Innovation is an expensive thing. As you ask any great innovator, the Musks and so on, and they will tell you that it costs a lot of money. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago and countries similar to us, it will cost a lot of money in the form of foreign exchange, because the experimentation, the penetration of markets, the this and the that, in trying to get your goods and services available elsewhere, whether that is the current production, the current set of goods and services that we have, or new ones. This is an expensive thing, and it costs a lot of money in foreign exchange. Some of this money and some of what we already have, and even before this, I was saying that the current stock that we have, including the Heritage and Civilization Fund, should be used to finance innovation, where innovation involves the creation of new products, and that doesn't necessarily mean you can put new old wine in new bottles, and that's a form of innovation. Once you can get these things sold on the foreign market, you're doing very well. But some of this activity will have to be financed, and it is not a bad idea to start using existing stocks, including what we have recently added, to finance innovation. Innovation is a risky business. Innovation costs money. Innovation costs foreign exchange. And now is the time to start doing it. Of course, the best time to have done that is when we had bigger stocks of foreign exchange. But we never believe when the oil boom comes that the oil will leave us again. It has left us all the time. But like in some relationships, you're going back to the same person, and they're going to treat you good for a period. And then the ultimate inevitability is that it's going to treat you very, very poorly again. And that's our relationship with the petroleum sector.
All right. Let me say something. The leader of the opposition said the other night in her forum that what the Prime Minister was saying was not likely to happen, and that they would probably use the money to deal with the deficit, because that seems like the main concern of the Minister of Finance. First of all, do you think she's right? And secondly, would that be a good use of that kind of funding?
Well, I more or less said that is not going to be a good use of that kind of funding. Any conversion of our foreign exchange, our existing stock, some of it is inevitable, but any misuse of the funds that is being used to finance local consumption, to pay wages and salaries, to meet, for instance, obligations associated with the pandemic. This is a conversion of the stock into TT dollars, and inevitably a demand on imports, and that is not going to solve our problems. All that will continue to keep us afloat, keep us in body and spirit together, and we will clearly have a good life for a few years again. But that is not going to last, and once that comes to an end, we are going to have some serious trouble.
So we should not use any part of that money for deficit.
Certainly not the new little bit that we got. I mean, that should be completely dedicated to things. But you cannot have people suffering while you have some money available. You're going to have a riot on your hands sooner or later. So it is inevitable that some of this will have to be used for just to keep things afloat. you don't want to reach a situation where you run out of things like rice, flour, and so on. You don't want to get into that kind of mess that the Guyanese got into a few years ago. And you have to then ask all your friends who are coming to see you to bring this and to bring that and to bring 5 pounds of flour for you. And so you don't want that kind of problem. So yes, the money has to be used to keep us going. After all, it's our money, and we should be kept going. But some of that, and that's the argument that I made the last time, you have to think the best time to do this has gone. But now is the second best time. If we don't do this thing now, we are going to be in serious trouble. And I am not, I heard you speaking on the Afghanistan and other issues. I don't know to what extent that there can be serious conflagration that will result in the price of oil shooting up. We don't want to benefit from that kind of negative world situation. We don't want that at all. But if something causes the price of oil of energy products to rise, we will benefit. But as I mentioned to you, both in terms of oil and gas, and the latter is the bigger one, as you know, we are not doing well on the production side. And we don't know if some miracle could happen and we could find some gas and oil as they are now doing in Guyana. But once we are not sure of the oil sector, and there has been no other time in history where we have been so unsure of it, because production is declining as we speak. I'm not saying that. And all the new finds have not been turning up in the way that we would like them to. So even if we get a good price, we may not have the quantities available to follow. So yes, it is the need is great now for us to find alternatives to foreign exchange. And the Prime Minister and the government, and in fact, and you're going to ask me about the cabinet as you're meeting, they're going to be speaking of the pandemic, that is for sure, but they are going to be speaking about, in the coming budgets to come, about how to help the country diversify away from its dependence on the energy sector, away from a situation that is causing us heartache and is not likely in the foreseeable future. I should tell you that trying to forecast the price of oil is a dangerous thing, but a lot has changed since we started saying that a few years ago. We have alternative sources of energy. Some towns in Europe are now totally dependent on alternative sources of energy. Some trains in Europe, means of transportation, these things are happening. People are using the wind energy, the solar energy, wherever they can. And of course, they're using this very dirty shale oil, which is a big thing, which is the biggest threat, in fact, to us. And every time the price rises, I should also mention, it makes shale more profitable. And if shale becomes more profitable, that causes the price not to rise too high, because the shale then begins to enter into the market, and people will use it more liberally than they have been doing so far. So whether or not oil turns out to be good for us, it's time to stop it. It's time to stop that dependence. It's time to do like in Norway, and have other things. I feel fairly confident that the young Norwegian doesn't even know he has oil. I'm lying. I know that is not true, but they do not make that into the be all and the end all. They have one of the biggest wealth fund. They have the biggest wealth fund in the in the world, and they've been using that oil really to make sure that when the time comes, they have money. They would have
they've created futures. They have created futures. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and which is what we have not done. We continue to depend on that.
Look, but let me take this opportunity to summarize. Don't spend the money on the deficit. Spend the money to expand non-energy exports. Thirdly, see if you can find some way of facilitating at a rapid rate innovation in the economy.
The last two are related.
Yes.
The last 2 points are
right.
related.
And then You just got to where you were talking about the cabinet and what they should be discussing. So I will leave you to focus on that, except to mention two things. One, the Prime Minister said 41% expenditure, fiscal expenditure on subsidies is just too much. And we've got to make some cuts there. So he said that before he went into the cabinet retreat. So I imagine there's some discussion about that. And the second thing is that it's good enough to try to deal with people who are exporting now to help them to export more. But we need investment in diversified industries which can add to the export capacity of the country. Taking these two things, the need to cut expenditure and to change the pattern of expenditure, because he mentioned that too. And secondly, to get new investment to stimulate a more diversified export-oriented industry. Find yourself now into the cabinet retreat and listen to what they might be talking about and tell me what, in your view, if you were present and being a witness there, even a silent witness, what are some of the things that you would be concerned about and want to ensure that the cabinet talked about?
Let me start off with the issue of the subsidies. That is fully true. And I mean, and to a large extent, we even subsidize employment in this country. You know, we have technically a very low rate of unemployment. It's in the 5-6%. And we haven't been seeing the figures lately, but we know that it's not as bad as, let's say, a European country, France, or anybody like. And the reality is that some of this is artificially created. It is based on the monetization of government's use of foreign exchange. And it is also, as a consequence of that, it's a pull on imports and so on. So yes, for years, people like myself have been talking about, let's say, the gas subsidy, which is a big one, and that some effort has been put into that. And at the last budget, they spoke about liberalizing, letting the individual gas stations charge what they wish. There may be some control on this, but most countries, that's exactly what happens. That you go into Britain, you choose the company with the cheapest rate. And we have had situations like that in Trinidad before. That used to be the case. So that the subsidies that are used are going to have to be addressed. The unfortunate thing is that we are doing it at a time when it ought not to be addressed, because we are using it at a time when people are hurting. So there is going to have to be a trade-off. And if I was sitting there, what I want to hear is, how are they going to do this trade-off? Because you cannot brutally remove some of these subsidies on which people depend. You should have done this at a time when you had the backup, when unemployment was not a serious problem, where people were going to. You don't choose the heart of a pandemic to impose some of the most brutal measures because you're looking for war. And that is what you don't want to have to add to the woes of the pandemic. So there's going to have to be a careful treading. And the situation is only going to be resolved in the medium and more likely in the long term, where we create an economy that is less dependent on the petroleum sector, on the energy sector, where the energy sector continues to grace us with its presence. Nothing wrong with that. We should take advantage of it. But for a growing GDP, less and less dependence on the oil, the energy sector. And if we don't spend the time on that and we simply use, because I know what is going to, I know that's going to preoccupy the government. They have a bill to pay to run the government. 90% of that budget is already predetermined to a large extent. So they have to find money to pay the cost of government. And that is not going to be an easy question to address. And just going to cut the subsidies that are available, because the people who benefit from the subsidies, technically, they are the poor. Unfortunately, the not so poor also benefit. That's what makes some of these subsidies so inefficient, because the people who really take advantage of them, like even the cost of university education and so on. I'm speaking about all grants and handouts that we're talking about here, the subsidizing of education. A lot of this is going to come into question. You cannot deal with this brutally, because you're going to cause a lot of dislocation, even more than you are causing, that is being caused at this point in time because of the pandemic. My own feeling is that they have to be concentrating more on the long term while making sure that the short term doesn't take us all the way to hell. That's what is going. But if you don't come out of this mess, you don't come out of the pandemic, you don't stop this slide of the economy, and the economy is sliding. If there is no way forward, and there's going to have to be a lot of convincing of the population that we are doing this because the end result will be better for us. And if I don't see that in the coming months that the grass is growing, but the horse will not die while the grass is growing, we have to, that is what they have to be. Unfortunately, it's the worst time to be making those kinds of decisions, because you don't have the backup C, as I think that's what the Jamaicans say, the backative, but you can't back it up, and that's a real issue that you have. But the issue of the subsidies must be addressed and must not be allowed to continue, so that our grandchildren will not be having this kind of problem. You're going to have to generate an economy that you don't need these things so much, and you don't need that every time you come to a budget discussion, that 9/10 of the discussion is going to be, how do I pay my current bills? And that is what is going to preoccupy them. Whereas what they should be talking about is, how do we come out of this pandemic? That's the number one item. That cannot be different. How do we get the population vaccinated? A lot of these discussions are going to be non-economic.
Yeah.
How do we get the population vaccinated? Because unless that happens, we are not going to get back anywhere. And if we try to do it otherwise, we're going to go right back, because the variants, the COVID variants, are benefiting from the non-vaccinated, and every time a new variant comes about, it makes it worse for the already vaccinated, because they become less immune to COVID-19 because of these new variants, and they're going to have to find a way to get the population vaccinated. That would have been the number one discussion for me, because that's what's going to cause.
Am I hearing you as saying that if there are three things that you feel that the cabinet needs to pay attention to, is, first of all, vaccinate the population, because nothing is possible without that. Secondly, be judicious in the cuts on subsidies, but we have to do it.
Yes.
And thirdly, put in some long-term measures that would deal with the question of the economic slide and the potential for growth and diversification.
That's correct.
You've got to do it now.
Yes,
you don't have a choice about it. It's a bad time for everything, but we have to do it now. So these are the three things that you would suggest.
Yes.
So Patrick, I want to thank you very much for being with us. We're coming to the top of the hour, and we've got to close.
Thanks for your good summaries. I like how you summarize what I say.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I mean, I'm not putting words in your mouth. I am taking from what you say.
Not at all.
Right,
yes,
yeah. So thank you very much for your contribution this morning. And I think the listeners and viewers would have benefited from
My,
it.
my pleasure.
And I
And I
hope the
did
government
enjoy
pays some attention.
I enjoyed your interview with the Prime Minister. I saw the Prime Minister and I liked that. I have hardly ever seen him. It was excellent. I thought it was very, very good.
You like that interview?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I thought that he was very straightforward in his answers, and I'm
Yes,
quite
very good.
frank with
Very
you.
good. No, it's very good. I was impressed. Yes.
All right then. Well, thank you very much, and we go now to Andrew Chan and the 7 o'clock news.